He took a bullet meant for justice, and he wasn't even human, as blood pooled at his paws and chaos exploded around him. The battered shepherd stood his ground while everyone else ran. In a world where betrayal wore uniforms and lies sat behind the bench, it wasn't a judge or a jury that held the line. It was him, a lone shadow against the storm. They came at him with bribes, poisons, knives hidden in handshakes, but he refused to yield, because deep inside his torn body still burned the final command of the man who believed in him. Protect the innocent at all costs. If you believe some heroes don't wear capes or uniforms, if you still believe courage has a heartbeat, stay with us. Like this story. Subscribe for more, and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to hear your voice. The sun stretched its early fingers across the city, splashing gold onto the stone steps of the courthouse. John Carter pulled his coat tighter against the brisk autumn air, his hand resting gently on Blaze's sturdy neck. The German shepherd, with his black and tan coat gleaming under the rising sun, stood alert but calm, his deep brown eyes scanning the sleepy square. John smiled faintly, feeling the old weight settle in his chest, not the weight of fear but of duty, the kind he had carried for over 30 years. His fingers brushed against the worn badge clipped to his belt. Today wasn't just another case. It was the case that one could tear down an empire of corruption if the witness inside that courthouse could stay alive long enough to speak. John bent down, adjusting Blaze's collar, his voice low and gravelly. Blaze flicked an ear in acknowledgement, his nose twitching toward the courthouse door, where early staff bustled in and out. John took a deep breath and guided Blaze up the steps. The marble walls loomed higher with each step, the grandeur of justice looking more like a tombstone than a temple. Inside, the security checkpoint buzzed with the rhythm of routine. Guards greeted John with nods of respect, but beneath their polite smiles, he sensed the unease. Everyone knew today was different. Everyone knew the stakes. It was a subtle twitch of tension across his broad shoulders, a low rumble deep in his chest that only John could hear. John squeezed the leash. Easy, boy. Eyes open. Blaze didn't whimper or bark. Instead, his head turned sharply toward a man in a pressed gray suit, holding a tablet too tightly, his knuckles white. Their eyes met for a split second. The man flinched. John felt a tickle at the back of his mind, a whisper of instinct honed over decades. Something's wrong. The man disappeared into a side corridor, and John made a mental note to remember the face, tight jawline, clean shave, cold blue eyes, no badge, no name tag. Blaze gave a low huff but resumed his pace. The waiting area outside Courtroom 6 was already filled with tension, reporters whispering like rustling leaves, the witness sitting stiffly between two marshals, her hands clutched around a paper coffee cup. A young woman, mid-30s, plain brown hair tucked under a beanie, sunglasses hiding the kind of terror that no disguise could mask. John approached slowly, letting Blaze take the lead. The shepherd sniffed the air, moving methodically around the benches, ignoring the curious glances from the crowd. Blaze was a veteran too, in his own way trained not just to attack but to sense the invisible. Adrenaline, fear, danger. The woman, sensing John's presence, looked up. For a moment her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. John simply nodded, offering a silent promise he intended to keep. You will survive this. The courtroom doors creaked open. The bailiff, a stocky man with a harried expression, waved them in. As they crossed the threshold, Blaze suddenly stopped dead. His body stiffened, muscles coiling under his fur. His nose lifted, scenting something that John couldn't see or hear. Blaze? John whispered, leaning down. Blaze's gaze locked on a ventilation grate near the floor, where a faint smell of chemical, metallic lingered. John cursed silently. Could it be gas, explosives, something else? He straightened up, keeping his expression neutral. There was no time to panic. The judge was already entering from chambers, the clerk rattling papers, attorneys setting up. The jury box creaked as citizens took their seats. John moved the witness carefully toward the front row, where the marshals would have clear lines of sight. Blaze never stopped scanning, ears flicking like radar dishes. John felt the old thrill he hadn't tasted in years. Pure, clean, adrenaline sharpening his senses. He didn't need to see the enemy to know the battle had already begun. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Sullivan, leaned in close. "You sure you want to sit here, Carter? You could be in the gallery safer." John shook his head. "She's scared enough, she needs to see someone who won't run." Sullivan nodded grimly. Courtroom 6 wasn't the biggest, but today it felt like a ticking bomb wrapped in wood paneling and marble. The judge's gavel struck and proceedings began. As testimonies started to flow, Blaze lay at John's feet, unmoving, like a carved statue, but his eyes never stopped moving. The woman's voice trembled as she recounted names, dates, transactions. Every word she spoke peeled back another layer of the conspiracy: police officers, council members, even judges implicated. John felt Blaze tense slightly when the back door creaked open. A janitor wheeled in a trash bin, but Blaze's nose twitched violently, his body rising slightly. John stiffened. Something about the janitor: too fast, too nervous, his hands inside the trash bag for too long. John rose casually, murmuring to a nearby deputy, sending him a silent message. "Check him." The janitor froze when approached. After a brief scuffle, a handgun was pulled from the bin. The courtroom buzzed with shock, the judge slamming his gavel for order. The janitor was dragged away, screaming incoherent threats. Blaze sat down again, watching with feral intensity. John leaned down, whispering, "Good boy," but his heart sank. If they were already this desperate during preliminary testimony, what would they attempt when the witness named the ringleaders? Blaze's nose pressed against John's leg, firm, insistent. John understood. The dog sensed it too. This was only the beginning. As the session recessed for lunch, John found a quiet corner near the elevators. Blaze circled once, then laid his massive body against John's boots, as if physically tethering him to the earth. John absently scratched behind his ear, murmuring, "Don't worry, partner, we're gonna get her through this." Blaze sighed, eyes half closing, but his ears remained tilted toward the courtroom doors. Always listening, always ready. For a few blessed minutes, John allowed himself to pretend that duty alone would be enough, that the system would hold, that they could walk out of this building into a safer world. But deep inside, the old instincts gnawed at him. In battles like these, victory always had a price. And sometimes it wasn't paid by the guilty. Outside, clouds gathered over the courthouse dome, the bright morning giving way to a heavy gray. Blaze shifted restlessly, his tail thumping once, a heartbeat against the cold marble floor. John stared out at the gathering storm and whispered a prayer only Blaze could hear. John Carter adjusted his grip on the leash as he guided the witness through the bustling corridor, his boots echoing off the cold marble floor, Blaze heeling perfectly by his side. The air inside the courthouse had thickened, charged with the kind of static that clung to your skin just before a storm broke. And although John moved with the steady confidence of a seasoned veteran, every instinct inside him screamed caution. The witness, her knuckles whitening around the thin folder she clutched to her chest, kept her head low, her steps hurried. But it was Blaze who first picked up the disturbance, his body stiffening like a drawn bow as they neared the elevator bank. Without warning, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from Blaze's throat, low enough that only John could hear it clearly over the background noise of shuffling feet and murmuring voices. John's eyes immediately scanned the area, sharp and precise, just as he had done 1,000 times before. And that's when he saw a man in a charcoal gray suit, moving against the current of the crowd, head slightly bowed but his posture far too rigid to blend in naturally. For a split second, their eyes met, and John felt a cold jolt lance through his spine. The man's face was unremarkable yet too carefully plain, as if constructed precisely to be forgotten. But it was the look in his eyes, flat, predatory, that struck John harder than any blow. In a blink, the man turned and disappeared into a side stairwell, the door clicking shut with a soft finality that somehow sounded louder than the courthouse buzz. Blaze's growl deepened, and John gave a slight tug on the leash, murmuring under his breath, "Not now, buddy, not yet." They moved forward quickly, but John's mind stayed riveted on that fleeting encounter, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He ushered the witness into the private holding room just off Courtroom 6, where 2 marshals stood guard, their expressions professional but strained. John ran a hand over Blaze's head, feeling the tension vibrating through the dog's powerful frame. "Eyes up," he whispered. He glanced at the marshals, taking in their details automatically: name tags, posture, The way one shifted slightly under his gaze. Trust but verified. That was how he had survived 3 decades in a city where even your friends could sell you out if the stakes were high enough. The holding room smelled of cheap coffee and disinfectant, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. John positioned the witness in the far corner, away from the door, then stood guard himself, Blaze settling into a crouch at his feet, still bristling but silent now. John allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, feeling the oppressive weight of the day settle onto his shoulders. He was reaching for the small bottle of water clipped to his belt when his phone vibrated violently against his hip. The number was unknown, no caller ID, just a black void on the screen. John's gut twisted tighter. He stepped back toward the wall, away from the marshal's line of sight, and answered quietly. The voice on the other end was distorted, masked by some cheap software, but the words cut through with terrifying clarity. "You can't trust them," the voice rasped, mechanical and cold. "One of the marshals, maybe more. They're not here to protect her, they're here to silence her." John's heart slammed against his ribs, his free hand automatically dropping to the holstered Glock at his side. "Who is this?" he hissed, but the line clicked dead, leaving only the soft buzz of static in his ear. For a moment, John stood there, feeling the cold sweat bead at the base of his neck. Blaze shifted, sensing the spike in his partner's adrenaline. John knew better than to dismiss the warning. No matter how anonymous the man-eyes were shouting, he glanced sidelong at the 2 marshals, who appeared to be conversing quietly near the door. One of them, a younger man with buzz-cut hair and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, caught John's gaze and quickly looked away. John weighed his options rapidly. He could pull the witness out now, but that would draw too much attention, create too much noise. The predators were already circling. If he moved too obviously, they might strike harder, faster. No, he needed to think. He needed to move like water, flowing around the obstacles without giving them anything solid to push against. He knelt down next to Blaze, making it seem like he was merely adjusting the harness. But in reality, he was giving Blaze a silent command. "Watch them, mark them, be ready." Blaze responded with a slight twitch of his tail, a signal only John would notice. They had worked too many scenes together, survived too many near misses, for words to be necessary now. John rose smoothly, casually checking the time on the battered watch strapped to his wrist. 7:42 a.m. Time was slipping through his fingers, each second a bead of blood on the courthouse floor. Somewhere deep in the belly of the building, a bell chimed, elevator doors opening. People shuffling, normal courthouse noises, but in John's ears everything had gone razor sharp, every sound carrying a hidden threat. He moved to the door, positioning himself between the marshals and the witness, his posture loose but ready, a coil of steel wrapped beside him, muscles taut beneath his gleaming coat, eyes flicking between the 2 marshals and the door. Then, just beyond the thick glass, John saw the man in the gray suit again, this time slipping into the back of the courtroom, blending among the spectators gathering for the next session. His heart stuttered once before hammering faster. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a coordinated move, and it was already underway. John's phone buzzed again, a single text message flashing on the cracked screen. "Move now or lose everything." He inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, forcing his racing heart into submission. He turned toward the marshals, offering a grim smile. "Stay sharp," he said evenly. "I've got a bad feeling about this." They nodded, but John didn't miss the flicker of something, fear, guilt, in the younger one's eyes. Blaze's ears twitched again. Somewhere far above them, thunder grumbled low across the sky. A distant warning. John knew he had only moments to decide whether to trust the badge or trust the dog. And as Blaze's growl rumbled once more, so low and lethal that it seemed to vibrate through the floor, John Carter made his choice. The courtroom settled into a hushed tension as the judge took his seat and the clerk called the court to order. John Carter positioned himself along the wall just behind the witness stand, his posture relaxed but his mind sharpened to a needlepoint. Blaze sitting obediently by his side yet vibrating with coiled energy. The witness glanced back at John once, her expression fragile and terrified. John gave her a nod, steady and silent, signaling that she wasn't alone, that whatever hell was about to break loose, they would face it together. The prosecution opened their case with a slow, methodical statement, the words barely registering to John as he scanned the room, cataloging exits, faces, potential threats. He spotted the man in the gray suit near the back, seated among the audience, his hands resting too calmly in his lap. But before John could process the implications, the lights overhead flickered once, twice, casting the room into a stuttering dance of light and shadow. Blaze exploded into furious barking, the deep, savage sound reverberating off the marble and wood, slamming into the ears of everyone present. John's instincts fired instantly, decades of experience compressing into a single split-second clarity. The flickering lights weren't a malfunction. They were a signal, a silent go-ahead for an attack already in motion. John drew his sidearm in a smooth, practiced motion, scanning for threats. But even as he moved, he caught it from the corner of his eye, the uniform of a fellow officer, one of the courthouse security team, breaking ranks, his hand diving into his jacket where no sidearm should have been stored. In a world that seemed to slow down to syrup, John watched as the man whipped out a compact pistol, his arm snapping up toward the witness. A bead of cold sweat popped at John's temple. Blaze lunged forward with a snarl, but John was already moving, his body reacting faster than thought. He threw himself between the shooter and the woman, the report of the gunshot cracking like a whip through the room. Fire lanced into John's side just beneath his ribs, the impact nearly lifting him off his feet. His knees buckled, but he managed to keep himself upright long enough to knock the witness to the floor behind the stand, shielding her with his own body as the courtroom dissolved into chaos. Screams erupted from every corner. Jurors ducked under their benches. Attorneys scrambled for cover. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, shouting for order to no avail. Another shot fired but missed wide. Blaze launched like a missile, teeth flashing, crashing into the armed officer with bone-jarring force. The gun skittered across the polished floor. John gasped against the agony flaring in his side, clutching the witness tighter to protect her as Blaze pinned the assailant to the ground. A second security officer rushed in, trying to pull Blaze off, but John bellowed through the pain, "Stand down, he's dirty," and something in his voice, raw, commanding, irrefutable, froze the man mid-match. Blood dripped from John's fingertips as he struggled to stay conscious. He could feel the hot slickness seeping through his shirt, staining his jacket. Blaze's growls filled the courtroom, low and relentless, a primal warning to anyone else thinking of making a move. John's vision blurred for a heartbeat, then cleared as he forced himself to focus. The gray-suited man was on his feet now, pushing toward the exit. One hand darting inside his coat, John opened his mouth to shout a warning, but his breath hitched, a white-hot spear of agony tearing through his chest. Blaze saw him first. Blaze moved before John could. The dog yanked free of the officer trying to restrain him and tore across the courtroom floor. A blur of black and tan muscle and fury. The gray-suited man turned just as Blaze slammed into him, sending both of them sprawling against the heavy oak doors. The gun clattering harmlessly across the tiles. Marshals swarmed the scene, finally breaking through their paralysis, pinning the shooter and the gray-suited accomplice to the floor. John sagged against the witness stand, every heartbeat a hammer blow inside his skull. The witness clung to his jacket, her hands shaking so violently he thought she might tear it in two. "Got you?" John rasped, barely above a whisper. "You're safe." And in her wide, terrified eyes he saw something flicker, a fragile hope fighting to survive under layers of fear. Blaze returned to his side, panting heavily, his muzzle flecked with spittle and fury. He pressed his weight against John's leg, grounding him, anchoring him to the world. Somewhere above them, sirens howled, the cavalry finally arriving, too late to prevent the ambush. Deputies rushed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The traitorous officer lay groaning on the floor, Blaze's teeth inches from his throat, a tableau of betrayal and vengeance frozen under the harsh glare of the resurrected overhead lights. Paramedics pushed through the melee, dropping to their knees beside John, cutting away his jacket and shirt with efficient hands. Someone shouted for a stretcher, someone else screamed for crowd control. But John's attention tunneled down to the witness who knelt beside him, gripping his hand with desperate strength, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You held your ground," John managed to choke out, his lips pulling into a bloodied smile. "That's all that matters." The witness shook her head fiercely, words failing her. and John saw it then, the true cost of what he had sworn to protect. Not just testimony, not just justice, but the fragile belief that someone, somewhere, would stand between the innocent and the darkness. Blaze whined low in his throat, licking John's blood-smeared hand once, a gesture of fierce loyalty and a plea for him to hold on a little longer. The paramedics lifted John onto the stretcher. Blaze tried to follow, snarling at anyone who got too close until John murmured, "Stay, guard her." And Blaze, understanding the command deeper than words, turned and stationed himself beside the witness, his body a living barricade against any further threat. As they wheeled John out, the ceiling tiles wheeling overhead in a dizzying blur, he caught a final glimpse of Blaze standing sentinel, muscles taut, eyes burning, a silent promise made flesh. He closed his eyes against the blinding lights of the hallway, letting the pain pull him under, knowing that somewhere behind him, the battle was far from over. The fluorescent lights above John Carter blurred into a smear of white as the stretcher jolted over the cracked tiles, every vibration sending new waves of agony rippling through his shattered side. He tried to stay awake, tried to fight the darkness curling at the edges of his mind, but his strength, like the blood pooling beneath him, was leaking away with every second. Blaze was just a distant figure now, framed in the doorway of Courtroom 6, a statue of fury and devotion. The paramedics barked orders at each other, their faces tight with urgency, but John barely heard them, his world narrowing down to the burning ache in his ribs, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, and the desperate knowledge that he had to do one more thing before the lights swallowed him whole. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright for a fraction of a second against the restraints, the world tilting wildly around him, and through the blinding haze he locked eyes with Blaze, who was watching him with an intensity so fierce it felt like a physical tether, pulling John back from the brink. The paramedic tried to push him down, murmuring, "Easy, sir, easy," but John shook his head violently, every muscle screaming in protest. He turned his head toward Blaze, forcing the words past lips that barely obeyed him. "Blaze," he rasped, blood bubbling in his throat. "Protect her." The effort of speaking ripped a tearing sound from his chest, but he didn't care. He had said what needed to be said, the last order, the only order that mattered. Blaze's ears pricked at his name, his body going rigid as he absorbed the command. There was no confusion in those deep, dark eyes, only understanding, pure and total, the kind of bond forged not in training rooms or certification tests, but on streets soaked in blood and streets lined with ghosts. Blaze dipped his head once, a motion so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone but John. And then, the stretcher pushed through the doors, cutting off the sight of his partner, cutting off the sight of the courtroom and the witness and the life he was leaving behind. The hallway swallowed John whole, the noise of the world growing muffled as the darkness finally began to win. But even as his vision faded, even as the chill of approaching death coiled around his limbs, John Carter smiled, because he knew Blaze had understood. He knew the mission would be completed. He knew the witness was not alone. Inside the courtroom, the chaos slowly ebbed into an uneasy silence. The marshals regrouped, the spectators huddled against the walls, but in the center of it all stood Blaze, an immovable sentinel, the witness behind him trembling but alive, her hands gripping the bench as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this crumbling reality. Blaze stood with his legs squared and his head low, searching for any further threat, the blood from the earlier attack still staining the floor in thin, ugly rivulets. But Blaze paid it no mind. His world had narrowed to a single directive: protect. The courthouse staff attempted to approach the witness, their voices strained with concern, but Blaze barred their way with a warning growl, deep and bone-shaking, his eyes gleaming like burning coals under the flickering lights. He didn't differentiate between friend or foe anymore. Trust had been shattered by betrayal, and until John Carter himself returned to rescind the order, no one was getting past him, not even those who wore the same uniform. The deputy marshal in charge, a grizzled man named Harris, made the mistake of stepping too close, extending a hand toward the woman as if to comfort her. Blaze snapped his jaws an inch from Harris's outstretched fingers, the sheer violence of it halting mad mid-stride. The growl that rumbled from Blaze's chest was low and constant now, a warning that required no translation. Harris raised his hands and backed away slowly, muttering, Jesus Christ, that dog's gonna kill someone. But Blaze didn't budge, didn't blink. His entire body was a fortress built of flesh and loyalty and righteous fury. Time dragged heavy and thick. The bailiffs tried to reassert control, tried to calm the spectators, tried to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. But Blaze's presence shattered that illusion with every ticking second. No one moved without calculating whether they could get past the dog alive. No one spoke without watching the ripple of his muscles beneath his sleek coat. The air was electric with barely contained terror, and Blaze soaked it in, analyzed it, measured it against his mission. The courtroom doors swung open again and a fresh wave of deputies flooded in, weapons holstered but hands twitching near them. Blaze's head snapped around, his gaze slicing through each of them, cataloging, weighing, judging, and when one of them, a young deputy with too much fear in his eyes and too little discipline in his hands, tried to approach with a calming voice and an open palm, Blaze let out a snarl so savage it stopped the man cold. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The presiding judge, an elderly man named Monroe, descended from the bench, his face pale but composed. He tried to reason with Blaze, tried to use the same measured tone he used on unruly defendants. But Blaze wasn't a defendant. Blaze wasn't a man. Blaze was a weapon tempered in loyalty and loss, and no amount of words could divert him from the path John had set him upon. The witness sobbed quietly behind him, not out of fear of Blaze but out of fear of everything else, the weight of the eyes on her, the knowledge that she was the axis upon which so much death now spun. Blaze flicked an ear at the sound but didn't turn his head. His senses remained locked outward, on the corridors, on the stairwells, on the dark spaces where danger might gather. Blaze shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself squarely between the woman and the room. Muscles rippling under his coat, his eyes narrowed to slits of burning gold, and in the flickering half-light of the failing courthouse lamps, he looked less like a dog and more like some ancient guardian, summoned forth from blood and oath to protect a single, fragile life against the world. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain hammering against the tall windows, thunder rattling the very bones of the courthouse. But inside courtroom 6, Blaze stood unmoving, unyielding, a silent wall of defiance against the gathering storm both outside and within. And as the first crackle of lightning forked across the darkened sky, casting monstrous shadows across the polished floors, the witnesses to that moment would remember it forever. The black and tanned figure, scarred and blood-flecked, guarding justice itself against a world eager to crush it. The storm outside pounded relentlessly against the courthouse windows, the wind howling like a living thing. But inside courtroom 6, Blaze remained as immovable as a mountain, the black and tan shepherd positioned firmly between the terrified witness and anyone who dared approach, his body coiled and ready, his eyes burning with fierce, unwavering loyalty. The marshals and courthouse staff circled uneasily at the edges of the room, murmuring among themselves, casting anxious glances toward the dog who refused to yield an inch. Time seemed to slow, measured only by the flickering overhead lights and the steady hammer of rain on glass. The first attempts to breach Blaze's defenses came disguised as kindness. A balding janitor approached with a mop and bucket, whistling tunelessly. His gaze a little too sharp beneath drooping eyelids, he sloshed water dangerously close to the witness's bench, nudging the bucket toward Blaze with a casual kick. But Blaze didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply bared his teeth in a silent snarl that made the janitor's face drain of color. The man backed away hastily, muttering curses under his breath. Next came the food. A bailiff John had once trusted wheeled in a cart with 2 covered trays, claiming it was lunch for the witness and a peace offering for the dog. The smell of roast meat filled the courtroom, rich and mouth-watering. But Blaze only lowered his nose slightly, sniffed once, and then growled, deep and guttural, a sound of ancient warning that froze the bailiff in place. One glance from Blaze's burning eyes and the man abandoned the cart and fled. An evidence technician who wasn't scheduled to be there tried to slip close with a clipboard in hand. Muttering something about paperwork, Blaze intercepted him 3 feet from the witness, his hackles raised, his teeth glinting in the fractured light. The man stammered an apology and retreated, leaving a scent of fear hanging thick in the air. The minutes dragged into hours. The courthouse grew quieter as the storm worsened. The hallways outside dimmed and emptied, But Blaze never let his guard drop, not even when exhaustion began to gnaw at his powerful muscles, not even when hunger twisted his gut into knots. John's command had embedded itself in the deepest fibers of his being, and nothing, no trick, no bribe, no force would move him. The witness behind him slept fitfully, her body curled into the corner of the bench, her face pale and hollow-eyed even in slumber. Every time she stirred or whimpered, Blaze's ear flicked back toward her, monitoring, ensuring she was still breathing, still safe. Somewhere around the 20th hour, the real threat arrived, cloaked not in malice but in disarming friendliness. A young woman in a sleek navy suit entered the room, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, a leather briefcase clutched neatly in her hand. Her badge identified her as a defense attorney, and she carried herself with the brisk, self-important air of someone used to being obeyed. The deputies let her through without question, assuming she was there on legitimate business. Blaze watched her with sharp, narrowed eyes as she approached, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her movements smooth, too smooth. She smiled at the witness, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and knelt a few feet away, pulling papers from her briefcase in a careful, measured motion. Blaze's nostrils flared, catching the faintest whiff of metal and oil, something wrong buried beneath the layers of perfume and paper and cheap ink. The woman spoke in a soothing tone, murmuring about legal protection and appeals, her voice honeyed and false. Blaze moved one step forward, slow and deliberate, his paws making no sound on the floor. The woman continued to chatter, flipping pages in the file, but her hand dipped a fraction too low, a movement too and Blaze caught at the glint of steel hidden in the folder. A compact pistol no bigger than her palm, fitted snugly between sheets of meaningless legal jargon. Without warning, Blaze erupted into motion, a blur of muscle and rage. He lunged, teeth snapping, knocking the briefcase aside with a violent swipe of his paw. The gun clattered to the ground, skidding across the polished floor. The woman shrieked, stumbling backward. But Blaze was already on her, pinning her to the ground with terrifying precision. His jaws clamped just inches from her throat, vibrating with a growl so low it seemed to rise from the earth itself. The deputies, finally snapping out of their stupor, rushed forward, dragging the woman away and securing her in cuffs, the gun retrieved and bagged as evidence. The witness sobbed against the bench, clutching her hands to her chest. Blaze turned back toward her, his body shielding her completely. The deputies tried to approach again, their hands extended, their voices coaxing, but Blaze stood firm, his message clear. No one would touch her, not after this, not after all the betrayal hiding behind badges and friendly smiles. The female attorney, pinned against the wall now, glared at Blaze with pure venom, spitting curses in a language Blaze didn't need to understand. He could smell the hate radiating off her, sour and desperate. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared her down until she turned her face away in defeat. Hours later, as midnight passed and the courthouse settled into an uneasy hush, Blaze still hadn't moved from his post, his body rigid with purpose, his ears twitching at every creak of the aging building, every gust of wind against the battered windows. His stomach cramped painfully, thirst parched his throat, but he endured, because endurance was all he had left now. Endurance and the final order from the only human he had ever truly trusted. Outside, the storm began to weaken, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. But inside, the real battle was still raging, silent and unseen, waged not with guns or fists, but with willpower, patience, and the unbreakable bond between a dying man and a living weapon. And Blaze alone, surrounded by enemies, battered by exhaustion, refused to fall. The cold dawn crept through the fractured windows of the courthouse, painting the walls in a sickly gray. The storm had broken sometime in the night, leaving behind a drenched, sullen silence that settled like dust over Courtroom 6. Blaze stood unmoving at his post, muscles taut beneath his battered frame, the witness sleeping fitfully behind him, a broken shadow of the woman she had been when she first stepped into the courtroom. Deputies and marshals rotated shifts nervously at the perimeter, but none dared get too close. None dared disturb the living wall that John Carter had left behind. Outside the sealed doors, behind heavy oak and cold marble, a different storm was raging. The courthouse's internal security team pored over endless hours of surveillance footage, fast-scrolling through grainy, colorless images, desperate to make sense of the chaos that had erupted within these walls. At first glance, the attackers had seemed like infiltrators, outside threats smuggled into the beating heart of justice. But as the cameras rolled back, layer after layer of footage peeling away the lies, a far more chilling truth emerged. It wasn't outsiders who had breached the court's sanctity. It was insiders, faces known, faces trusted, faces wearing uniforms and badges that once symbolized law and order. It was the janitor whose shift didn't exist on the official roster, the bailiff who had no business serving food, the security officer who had opened the wrong doors at precisely the right time. The realization fell heavy and brutal on the chief of security, a grizzled man named Sanders, who had served 30 years without scandal. He stared at the monitors, at the incontrovertible betrayal playing out in washed-out grays and blues, and felt bile rise in his throat. He slammed his fist against the desk, sending a plastic coffee cup flying. "God damn it," he barked, spinning to face the grim-faced agents gathering behind him. "This wasn't an attack," he said, his voice raw. "This was an inside job." Whispers rippled through the room. Men and women who had sworn to uphold justice now realizing they were standing in a battlefield riddled with traitors. Someone else, a tech officer younger than the rest, stammered from his desk. "Sir, there's more. We found something." Sanders crossed the room in 3 quick strides, leaning over the young man's shoulder, his heart pounding. The screen displayed a file directory, hidden behind layers of encrypted junk. A file simply labeled Project Shepherd. "Open it," Sanders growled. The tech complied, and what spilled across the screen froze the entire room into statues. Scanned documents, faded photographs, typed memos, a spiderweb of corruption spreading like cracks in glass. At the center of it, one name kept reappearing, handwritten notes in margins, official reports with portions blacked out, covert surveillance images clipped from security feeds. Sanders staggered back a step, feeling as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. The pieces clicked into place with savage, merciless clarity. John hadn't just been protecting the witness, he had been the target. Not because of the testimony about to be given, but because of what John himself knew. John Carter had been quietly investigating the courthouse's own underbelly for months, maybe years, documenting bribery, obstruction, and full conspiracy reaching into every crevice of the system they were supposed to protect. The final confirmation came with the list, a simple PDF buried deep within the Project Shepherd folder. Names neatly typed, their ranks, their departments, their vulnerabilities. And, next to John's name, a cold, clinical annotation. DNR, do not resuscitate. Sanders swore violently, his hands shaking with a fury he hadn't felt since the war zones of his youth. He slammed his fist again into the table, then straightened, his face going hard. He turned to his second-in-command, a woman named Vasquez with iron in her spine and fire in her eyes. "Get me a secured line to the district attorney's office," he said, "now." Vasquez moved at once, understanding in a glance the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. Across the courthouse, unaware of the revelations unfolding in the surveillance room, Blaze remained vigilant. A flicker of movement beyond the glass doors sent a ripple through his powerful frame. Every unfamiliar scent stiffened his spine, the minutes dragged into hours, and still he did not yield. The witness stirred again, murmuring broken dreams into the heavy air. Ambulance flicked his ear toward her but did not move. Somewhere in his deep canine memory, John's voice echoed, commanding him to protect, to endure, to stand against the darkness no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Sanders paced the tiny room as the DA's secure line crackled to life. He delivered the findings in clipped, furious sentences, no embellishment, no speculation, just cold, hard treason carved into digital stone. The DA, an old friend of John's named Harold Whitmore, listened without interruption. But when Sanders finished, a long, brittle silence stretched between them. Finally, Whitmore spoke. His low and hoarse, he said, "There are still good people left in this building, but if the wrong ones get wind of what you found before we act..." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Orders flew through the secure channels like wildfire. Trusted marshals and clean deputies were quietly pulled aside. Informed, a plan coalesced in hushed voices and determined glances. The courthouse itself became a divided territory. loyalty and betrayal crisscrossing the floors and halls like invisible tripwires. Every face was a question mark, every uniform a potential threat. Sanders sent a trusted team to Courtroom 6 with explicit orders: reach Blaze and the witness, secure the perimeter, and prepare for extraction. But as the team geared up and moved into the corridors like silent wraiths, Sanders stared once more at the frozen image of John Carter on the monitor. Caught mid-stride in a grainy black and white still, Blaze beside him, their bond so tangible it practically radiated from the screen. Sanders pressed his hand to the glass, a silent, furious promise burning in his gut. They would not let John's death be in vain. They would not let the infection fester a second longer. In Courtroom 6, Blaze sensed the shift before the humans did. His nose lifted, tasting the new tension in the air, the faint electric crackle of something about to break. He shifted his weight, lowering his stance, muscles bunched and ready, eyes burning through the gloom as the first footfalls echoed beyond the door. The second night descended on the courthouse with a suffocating heaviness. The once roaring storm outside had dwindled to a cold, persistent drizzle. And inside Courtroom 6, the air was thick with stale sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood that even the best janitorial crews could not scrub clean. Blaze remained steadfast in his position, a sentinel cut from flesh and willpower, but the signs of his decline had begun to show. His flanks heaved harder with each breath. His legs trembled imperceptibly from the strain of remaining upright for so long. His pause, once sure and deliberate, now shifted occasionally with small, involuntary twitches, as cramps gnawed at tired muscles. Thirst burned his throat raw. Hunger hollowed his gut into a cavern of aching need. The wound from the earlier scuffle, a shallow but persistent gash along his shoulder blade, oozed sluggishly with every small movement, staining his black and tan coat darker in patches. The witness behind him, sensing something wrong, had tried to coax him to drink from a paper cup filled with water, but Blaze only flicked an ear in her direction, his gaze never wavering from the doors, his orders still echoing louder than pain or survival instincts. He could feel the world narrowing around him, the edges of his vision occasionally blurring, the sounds of the courthouse distorting as if underwater, yet every time his body threatened to collapse, some primal core inside him reignited, forcing his legs to lock, forcing his heart to hammer against the relentless pull of exhaustion. Late into the night, the janitorial staff resumed their cleaning round under the pretense of restoring normalcy. The courthouse administration, or what remained of it, insisted that appearances must be kept for the morning news crews waiting to spin whatever narrative best served those still holding fragile positions of power. Among the cleaning crew shuffled a boy no older than 14, thin and wiry, his uniform hanging off his frame like borrowed clothes. He pushed a mop bucket noisily across the polished floor, the wheels squeaking with every rotation, his brown eyes wide and darting as he scanned the nearly empty courtroom. Blaze's ears twitched at the new sound, his head swiveling just slightly to track the boy's approach. But the boy moved with exaggerated clumsiness, his posture screaming harmlessness. The marshals and deputies, now whittled down to a skeleton crew of those deemed loyal, barely gave the kid a second glance. The boy edged closer to Blaze under the pretense of mopping a spill, his small hands trembling around the handle, his breath hitching in his narrow chest. Blaze watched him with detached suspicion, his instincts dulled by dehydration and sheer exhaustion. He shifted his weight slightly, growling a soft warning but made no move to attack. The boy paused, whispered a string of apologies under his breath, and knelt as if to tie his shoelace. In the cover of that small, calculated movement, the boy pulled a tiny black device from his pocket, no bigger than a coin. Smooth and matte, it had no blinking lights, no sound. It was designed for one purpose only: to mark a target. He hesitated for the briefest of moments, his lip trembling, his conscience flickering. But then he reached forward, swift and silent, slipping the tracker into Blaze's thick fur just behind the heavy K9 collar, burying it so deftly that no human eye would have noticed. Blaze stiffened slightly at the contact, his teeth baring in a soft snarl. But the boy had already darted back, his hands raised, his mouth spilling a frantic stream of rehearsed apologies. Sorry, didn't mean to get so close." The deputies waved him off impatiently, their focus frayed thin by too many hours of tension and too few hours of rest. Blaze watched him retreat with a growing sense of unease, his instincts whispering that something was wrong. Something had been done, but he was too exhausted, too battered to react beyond a low growl vibrating in his chest. The boy pushed his mop bucket quickly toward the exit, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the device would begin transmitting within minutes, a steady pulse of location data feeding into a handheld receiver currently hidden beneath the floorboards of the records room downstairs. He didn't know who the men were that had paid him, didn't know what would happen once they had their signal. He only knew his mother's hospital bills were overdue, and the cash they had placed in his trembling hands was more than his family had seen in 6 months. As the door swung shut behind him, he cast one last, guilty glance over his shoulder. But Blaze had already turned away, his focus returning with agonizing effort to the mission, to the woman whose life depended entirely on him remaining alert. Minutes later, in the shadowy corridors deep within the courthouse's bowels, a group of men dressed in plain clothes gathered around a battered laptop. The tracker's signal blinked steady and strong on the screen, a tiny beacon pulsing from Courtroom 6. Their leader, a scar-faced man with cold blue eyes, grinned as he tapped the monitor with a gloved finger. "There he is," he murmured. "The damn mutt's not invincible after all." Plans began to form swiftly, efficiently, the kind of plans honed in dark alleys and smoke-hilled rooms where justice was just another word for leverage. They would move before sunrise, using the chaos of the courthouse's pending evacuation orders as cover. They would hit hard, hit fast, and finally silence the witness and the dog with surgical precision. Back upstairs, Blaze shifted his aching body slightly to relieve the burning cramps seizing his limbs, his breathing shallow, his vision darkening around the edges again. But he remained standing. He would not abandon his post, not until his body gave out completely, not until the last threat was vanquished. And as the courthouse settled into another deceptive lull, broken only by the occasional cough or creaking beam, Blaze waited, unaware of the beacon now flashing beneath his collar, unaware that the storm had only just begun to gather again. The courthouse loomed in the watery pre-dawn light, its once proud stone facade now a fortress of shadows and whispered betrayal. Inside Courtroom 6, Blaze stood swaying on unsteady legs, his breath rattling in his chest, the air around him heavy with the scent of sweat, fear, and the unspoken promise of violence. The witness huddled behind him, her wide eyes locked on the massive form of the dog who refused to fall, even as death crept closer with every minute. Outside the door, the small handheld receiver blinked furiously in the hands of men preparing for a final, decisive strike, and time, like everything else in that broken courthouse, was running out. At precisely hour 47 since the first shot had been fired, the main lobby doors creaked open against the protest of groaning hinges, letting in a gust of rain-chilled air and a figure that moved with a purpose sharper than any blade. Her name was Sergeant Maya Vance, a 30-year veteran with scars hidden beneath her regulation blues and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by the bureaucratic lies, layered thick over the current disaster. She had served with John Carter back when both their careers were young, when ideals hadn't yet been ground into dust by corruption and compromise. And she had loved him like a brother, trusted him with her life, and when the emergency orders came down from the higher-ups, orders to stand down and allow transition control, she had known immediately what they meant. John had been right all along. The rot went deeper than anyone had dared admit. Maya ripped off her name badge and tossed it into the overflowing trash can by the door, a symbolic rejection of the system she no longer recognized. Clutching her Glock low and tight against her thigh, she pushed forward, cutting through the deserted hallways like a knife through silk, avoiding cameras and patrols with the ease of someone who had been evading traps her whole life. Her boots were soaked by the time she reached the antechamber outside Courtroom 6, but her heart hammered with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She pressed herself against the wall, breathing deep, letting her body listen in the way John had taught her, listening not just for sound, but for tension, for movement, for danger breathing against the skin. Blaze's faint growl reached her ears first, a broken, worn-out rumble that still carried enough threat to make her chest tighten with fierce admiration. She rounded the last corner cautiously, raising her hands slightly as she stepped into view. Blaze's bloodshot eyes locked onto her immediately, his body sagging from exhaustion but his instincts razor-sharp. Even now she spoke in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, boy, easy, I said." Blaze's head tilted slightly, recognition flickering behind the haze of pain and fatigue. She dropped to one knee, letting her weapon dangle uselessly at her side. Making herself small, non-threatening, Blaze's ears twitched, his muscles quivering, but he didn't lunge, didn't snarl. Instead, he staggered forward one step, his nose working furiously to catch her scent under the layers of fear and adrenaline. Maya moved carefully, murmuring nonsense words under her breath the way she used to when approaching feral rescues. Inch by inch, she closed the distance until she was close enough to see the raw, cracked pads of Blaze's paws, the dried blood matting his shoulder fur, the bruises blooming under his thick coat. Her throat tightened painfully at the sight. She had seen war dogs break before, seen them laid low by wounds and sorrow, but Blaze was something different, something more. John's spirit burned inside this dog like a second heart. She extended a trembling hand, and Blaze pressed his heavy skull into it with a sigh so deep, so human, it shattered whatever was left of Maya's defenses. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You held the line. You held it longer than any of us deserved." Behind him, the witness whimpered softly, but Maya caught the shadow moving beneath the girl's jacket, the telltale twitch of a small black device. She sucked in a sharp breath, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Someone had marked Blaze. Someone had marked this whole damn courtroom. Without hesitating, Maya slipped around Blaze, her fingers nimble despite the tremor of rage coursing through her. She found the foreign object buried deep in the thick ruff of fur behind the K9 collar. Cursing under her breath as she worked it free, a tiny tracker no bigger than a fingernail, grinding it into the cracked tiles, then turned her attention to the collar itself, her fingers brushing against a small, unfamiliar bulge embedded near the buckle. A miniature body cam, charred slightly around the edges, but miraculously still functional. With a muttered prayer, Maya ripped it free and fumbled in her pocket for the portable reader she always carried, a habit John had drilled into her back when evidence had a way of conveniently disappearing. She plugged the cam into the reader, her blood roaring in her ears as the tiny screen flickered to life. For a moment there was only static, white noise hissing like ghosts in a graveyard, but then clear as a gunshot voices crackled through the tiny speaker, distorted but unmistakable. It was the conversation from the courthouse basement 2 nights ago, a meeting not meant for any recording device to capture. The voices belonged to senior officials, judges, marshals, even a deputy chief of police plotting the orchestration of John Carter's downfall, discussing payment schedules, cover-up strategies, how to handle the problem witnesses and ogre elements like Blaze, every word a nail hammered into the coffin of the institution they had sworn to serve. Maya's vision blurred with fury as she listened, her fingers tightening into a fist so hard the screen cracked slightly beneath her grip. She had her proof now, undeniable and raw, and she knew exactly what John would have wanted her to do with it. Blaze staggered beside her, his strength flickering like a candle against a hurricane. But his eyes, those battered, loyal eyes, locked on hers with a plea so clear it needed no translation. "Finish it." Outside the courtroom, the first faint echoes of boots pounding down the hallways reached Maya's ears. The enemy was coming, the final push was at hand, and they had very little time left to act. The doors of Courtroom 6 groaned open under the combined force of Maya and the few deputies still loyal to the badge. The stale air rushed outward, carrying with it the scent of sweat, gun oil, and the fading echoes of a battle fought on pure will. Blaze staggered forward into the dimly lit hallway, his body trembling with every step, blood from reopened wounds matting his fur. But his eyes burned with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. He did not falter, did not hesitate, even as his body screamed for surrender, because somewhere deep within that battered frame, the last command of John Carter still pulsed like a second heartbeat. Protect the witness, reveal the truth, finish the fight. Maya stayed close to Blaze, her weapon drawn low and steady, covering his flank. Behind them, the witness stumbled along, flanked by 2 grim-faced marshals who had chosen loyalty over career suicide. The courthouse around them was eerily quiet, emptied either by evacuation orders or by fear. The storm outside had faded into a soft drizzle. But inside, a different kind of storm churned, fed by betrayal, rage, and a desperate grasp for redemption. Blaze led them not toward the exits, not toward safety, but deeper into the courthouse's labyrinthine underbelly. Toward the old records wing sealed off years ago after a flood had rendered the lower floors unsafe. Maya's boots splashed through puddles of stagnant water as she followed. Her mind racing, she remembered John talking about the records room once. Late one night over whiskey and shared regrets. He had joked that the best place to hide something wasn't behind steel walls but beneath layers of bureaucracy and neglect. Blaze stopped suddenly at a rusted service door, his chest heaving, his tail rigid. He pressed his battered muzzle against the seam, whining low in his throat. Maya moved forward, slamming the butt of her pistol into the corroded lock until it snapped with a screech of torn metal. The door swung inward, revealing a darkness that smelled of mildew, old paper, and secrets too long buried. Blaze pushed through first, his movements jerky but determined. Maya flicked on her flashlight, slicing through the gloom. Rows upon rows of collapsed filing cabinets and swollen cardboard boxes stretched into the darkness. It would have taken days to search it by hand. But Blaze moved with certainty, his nose dragging along the cracked linoleum, ignoring the swirling currents of mold and decay. He veered left, past a toppled shelf, through a maze of debris, and stopped in front of a heavy storage locker bolted to the far wall. Maya rushed to his side, her light catching on the faint scratch marks along the bottom edge marks, she now recognized as John's crude but effective code for a hidden cache. Together, with the help of the deputies, they pried open the locker, revealing a sealed plastic container tucked behind a false panel. Maya's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were folders thick with documents, USB drives labeled in John's meticulous handwriting, and a battered leather notebook she recognized instantly. John's old field log stained with coffee, time, and the kind of truths too dangerous to live in official reports. Maya grabbed everything, cramming it into her tactical pack, just as the first shouts echoed down the hallway behind them. The enemy was moving faster now, sensing that their window for containment was closing. Blaze growled deep in his chest but remained pressed against Maya's leg. Ready to move, ready to fight if necessary, they retraced their steps through the ruined corridors. Moving swiftly, urgency driving them harder than any physical strength they had left. Maya barked into her radio, calling for extraction. Her voice sharp and commanding, no longer asking but demanding. Because now they had leverage. Now they had letharged almost nothing. A battered SWAT van screeched to a halt outside the courthouse's loading dock. Loyal officers piling out, weapons raised, forming a defensive cordon as Maya, Blaze, and the witness burst into the open. Rain pelted down from a gunmetal sky, soaking them instantly, but none of them paused. Blaze collapsed into the van first, his body giving out at last. Maya and the witness scrambled in after him. The doors slammed shut behind them, engines roaring to life as the convoy peeled away from the courthouse. Shots rang out from the shadows behind them, but the armored vans held, chewing up pavement as they raced toward the secure facility downtown, where truth could finally be dragged into the light. Inside the van, Maya ripped open the field log first, her fingers trembling as she flipped through pages covered in John's tight, slanted handwriting. Details spilled out in brutal clarity, payoffs traced to sitting judges, surveillance logs of clandestine meetings between city council members and organized crime bosses, blueprints for vote rigging, asset seizures, blackmail schemes, names, dates, places, evidence so thorough it would take they would fail, because now it wasn't locked in some dusty file or whispered in back rooms. It was here in the hands of those still willing to fight. The USB drives contained hours of recorded conversations, signed contracts, transfer receipts routed through shell companies, even photographs, blurry but damning, of meetings held in midnight diners and abandoned warehouses. Maya's heart pounded harder with every new revelation. She recognized faces among the documents, faces she had once saluted, faces that had once pinned shiny medals to her chest. The depth of betrayal was staggering, but so was the potential for justice. Blaze lay panting at her feet, his eyes half closed, his body racked with tremors, but when Maya reached down and touched his battered head, he gave her a weak thump of his tail, a signal that he knew that he had completed his mission. The witness, huddled in the far corner of the van, stared at the growing pile of evidence with something like hope kindling in her hollowed eyes. Maya met her gaze across the dim, rattling interior and nodded once. Grim and certain, they weren't just going to survive this. They were going to win. The convoy roared into the fortified parking garage beneath the federal building. Tires squealing against wet concrete, officers swarmed around them instantly, escorting the group into a shield wall of body armor and loaded weapons. Inside the secure briefing room, the evidence was dumped onto a massive conference table. Judges, prosecutors, and federal agents pouring over it with mounting horror. Every minute that ticked by drove another nail into the coffin of the corruption that had nearly consumed them all. Maya stood off to the side, arms crossed, Blaze leaning against her leg, barely conscious but still vigilant. She didn't need to see the outcome to know it was already sealed. They had ripped the mask off the system, torn down the walls behind which evil had flourished, and when the first arrests were announced over the loudspeakers, when the first handcuffs clinked around once powerful wrists, Maya closed her eyes and whispered, "You did it, John, you did it." The storm that had raged over the courthouse for days had finally passed, leaving behind a sky so blue it looked almost unnatural against the battered city skyline. In the weeks following the explosive revelations, arrests swept through the city's corridors of power like a tidal wave. Judges stripped of their robes, councilmen dragged from their mahogany offices in handcuffs, entire police units dissolved under federal investigation. The media devoured it, the public, long starved of real heroes, clung desperately to the story of a lone German shepherd who had stood, bloodied and unbowed, against a sea of corruption. Headlines screamed his name in bold block letters. Blaze, the hero of Courtroom 6. Morning shows replayed grainy footage of him guarding the terrified witness, refusing food, fighting off attackers with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. The people needed a symbol, a rallying point, and Blaze became exactly that. A special ceremony was held on the courthouse steps, banners fluttering in the crisp morning air. A crowd of hundreds gathered under the newly installed American flag that snapped proudly against the clear sky. Maya stood near the podium, her dress uniform pressed to perfection. Blaze sat at her side. His body sat held high. A custom-made medal hung from a broad leather collar around his neck, gleaming silver engraved with the words "Valor Beyond Duty." Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for better angles, children perched on their parents' shoulders to catch a glimpse of the dog who had, against all odds, saved justice itself. The Chief Justice, newly appointed and vetted down to his bloodline, leaned down and clipped a second badge onto Blaze's collar, officially naming him Honorary Deputy of the Court. It was a title created solely for him, a permanent place carved into the marble halls he had defended with tooth and claw. Maya placed a steadying hand on Blaze's flank as he shifted slightly, the crowd's roar of approval washing over them like a tide. Blaze's ears flicked, his nose twitching at the overwhelming scent of humanity, but he remained calm, dignified, the embodiment of the very ideals the courthouse had once only pretended to serve. After the ceremony, Blaze was slated to retire, to live out his days in comfort and peace. The city offered him everything: endless donations of toys, mountains of treats, cushioned beds embroidered with his name. But Maya knew Blaze, knew that purpose was the marrow in his bones, and that without it he would wither like a soldier exiled from the battlefield. She worried quietly about what would happen to him, She sat with him later that evening in a quiet room above the courthouse, his head resting heavily on her lap as the sunset bathed them in gold, when a sharp knock echoed at the door. Maya rose, brushing fur from her slacks, Blaze lifting his head sluggishly at the sound. Standing on the threshold was a young man, early 20s, in a crisp military dress uniform, the edges still stiff from recent issuing. His hair was cut high and tight, his boots polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes, deep-set, painfully familiar, that caught Maya's breath in her throat. The young man removed his cap, revealing a strong, proud face, one that bore the unmistakable echo of John Carter. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and controlled. "My name's Marcus Reed. I'm John Carter's son." Maya blinked, her mind spinning. John had never spoken of a son, had never once hinted at a life beyond his duty. The young man continued, his voice catching slightly. "I only found out about him last year. I enlisted after I learned." He trailed off, clenching the cap tighter in his fists. Blaze rose shakily to his feet, ears pricking forward. nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of something achingly familiar. Marcus knelt, ignoring the pristine uniform regulations he was breaking. Reaching out his hand tentatively, Blaze stepped forward, slow and cautious, his body quivering not with fear but recognition. Something deep inside him, some bond buried in blood and memory, recognized this boy not by scent or sight but by the silent thread that connected them both to John. Blaze pressed his head firmly into Marcus's chest, letting out a long, shuddering breath, and the young soldier wrapped both arms around the battered dog, burying his face in Blaze's fur. Maya watched, her throat thick, her hands clenching at her sides. She didn't interfere, didn't speak, because some moments demanded silence more than applause. After a long while, Marcus stood, his hands steady now, his gaze clear. "I want to take him," he said. "I want to honor my father, finish what he started." He nodded toward Blaze, who stood proudly at his side now, tail wagging slow but certain. The paperwork was a formality, signatures scrawled on dotted lines under the watchful eyes of too many witnesses. But when it was done, it was Maya herself who clipped the simple silver tag onto Blaze's collar, the one bearing the name Marcus Reed. She knelt and whispered into Blaze's ear, "You're not alone anymore, partner." Blaze licked her cheek once, solemnly, and then turned to follow Marcus out into the sunlight. The crowd outside erupted once more, but this time it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the sight, the image that would sear itself into the collective heart of a wounded city. A battered black and tan shepherd walking beside a young man in uniform, two warriors bound by blood, sacrifice, and an unbreakable oath to protect what others had tried to destroy. As Blaze and Marcus disappeared into the golden light, past the courthouse steps, past the echoes of broken promises and the whispers of redemption, Maya stood with her hand over her heart, her eyes dry but burning. Somewhere far above, she liked to believe John Carter was watching, his weathered face breaking into a rare, proud smile. Because though he had fallen, his legacy, his fight for justice had not died. It had been passed on, fierce and bright and unstoppable, carried forward by a new generation. A boy he never knew, a dog he had loved beyond words, and a city that perhaps still had a chance to be better than the darkness that once ruled it. If this story moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to stay with us for more unforgettable journeys. Which moment struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your voice.